that came up. Can we send the recording to people who are not here today but have attended trainings in the past that would like a refresher?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hold on, and now, even though I do this, oh, there it is. Even though I do this all the time, sometimes I lose a button or two on my screen as I'm talking. So right now, you should all be seeing my slides. Again, welcome to our training. Give me 1 second. Screen is not, oh, there it goes. Okay, sorry, just in case there's anyone else that comes into the training, or if there are questions that I missed in the chat, if you guys can just help me out because I don't always quite see them. All right, so for those of you who are not familiar, the Department of Housing for many years now has had a project called the Security Deposit Guarantee Program. It is not cash up front to a landlord, but it is literally a voucher that the landlord receives. And then at the end of a tenant's time in the unit, if there's unpaid damages or rent, then the landlord's able to recoup some of that money. The program has changed iteration over the time that it has been in has been active, and over time, because of state budgetary constraints, we have had to reduce access to the program. So historically, what's been so nice, particularly in New Haven, Liberty Community Services had always been highly involved in an access point for the project. But then when we lost some administrative funding, we had to go back to each of the CAN regions and say, we still want to offer this to individuals, but how can we do this? And so most of our regions went to more of a decentralized model, where a tenant no longer had to go directly to an agency, but they could work with a shelter case manager or someone in an outreach program to be able to access these services. So just like you would help someone to apply for any other kind of benefit, food stamps, utility assistance, you name it. This is just yet one other application process that you can assist people with when they're looking for an apartment. What I will say is this project is not for everybody. Much of what I'll talk about today is controlled by state regulation, which is really difficult for us to change. And so therefore, some of the things like vital document requirements, income documentation requirements, I think we acknowledge that they are not as low. In this case, it's kind of, this is what we've got to work with, and just kind of keeping in mind what's the right resource for a particular tenant that you're working with. So as I mentioned, most of our regions went to a decentralized process. Julia and Margaret will play a pretty vital role for all of you in the application process because they will sign off as kind of the local reviewer before an application gets submitted to the Department of Housing. Otherwise, we do train all of our outreach staff, our shelter staff, some of our housing providers as well, if their programs do not have security deposit built into their funding. And so what will happen is that we do the training, and then locally, once you complete a packet, again, it will be submitted to either Margaret or Julia to review, and then it gets passed along to the Department of Housing for final approval. And as I mentioned, there was a period of time where we reduced access to those who are chronically homeless. Most recently, we have opened it up to anyone moving on. So particularly for individuals who might be in a rapid rehousing program or a permanent supportive housing project, but moving on to, say, a RAP or an emergency housing voucher, those are all individuals who could be eligible to access this. And Julia, I saw that you put something in the chat.
Oh, yes, I just put the link to where people submit the security deposit guarantee for later reference. Sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt you.
So, and that's all done through the smart sheet, just as a way for Margaret and Julia to be able to flag those referrals and track them pretty seamlessly for all of you, so things don't get lost in email. And then, as we mentioned, in each of the CAN regions, there is a local point of contact. If for some reason Julia and Margaret were not able to keep up with the inflow of applications, which I don't think has been problematic to date, Liberty Community Services will also be there to assist. But for our purposes today, Margaret and Julia are your local points of contact. So some of the slides in here are just meant to be for future reference. This will be one of them that outlines the process. In addition to the paperwork packet that DOH puts together, there's all the other additional supporting documents that need to be included with the packet. And so this is just that particular checklist. So, we'll need to see homeless verification. Again, if someone has an HMIS program enrollment, that face sheet's okay, a third-party letter. We do need to see proof of social security number, a birth certificate, photo ID, income verification, or if someone does not have income verification, a signed declaration of that. If someone's receiving food stamps, we ask for documentation of those food stamps, along with a copy of their rental assistance certificate, if applicable, with the amount of the tenant portion of rent, and a copy of that lease. And so all of that paperwork, as Julia had mentioned, would be uploaded to the smart sheet. We also ask that it gets stored in HMIS as well, because if the department is ever audited, then of course we have one location to go back and collect those documents. Much of this, as you're working with people to do, to move into housing, it's best to start to try to collect some of this information as soon as you can, because as you can see, it's a really long list. And so you don't want to wait until that person locates a unit and the landlord says, oh, great, today's February 1st, they can move in on February 5th. This process is not going to happen that quickly. So typically, we'll say to give yourself about 2 weeks to collect all of this documentation. Margaret enough time to review it and pass it along to the Department of Housing. I will say, because of the pandemic, thankfully, we've been able to change some of our practices. We used to have to do all of this through US mail, which takes many days because where our offices are located in Hartford. But now we're able to do everything electronically, which has really been, in my opinion, really helpful in getting these things submitted and getting final approval. So the first thing in the process is what we call the HUT lookup. And sorry about that. So what we call the HUT lookup. And so that lookup is, it's our database that tracks all of the individuals who have participated or applied to the project since the very beginning. No one knows what HUT means on our end. It is such an old database, but it's one of those things. It's old, but it keeps on ticking and we're still using it. So our colleague is Penny Clark at the Department of Housing, and Penny maintains that database for us. So as you're working with someone, thinking about what the security deposit resource will be, first thing to do is to give Penny a call and she's going to ask you for all of the individuals who are going to be living in the unit, their name and their social security number. Because it's obviously client sensitive information, we ask that you call her as opposed to emailing her, because we don't want to transmit socials through email. So her number is there, the 860-270-8109 number. She's very when she does that lookup, she's going to tell you whether or not a person is eligible for the project. And when she does that, she can tell you one of several things. So she's going to say, yep, everything looks good. This person's never applied before. They're eligible. If someone has applied in the past 18 months, they're not going to be eligible to apply again. Some of this is a carryover from when we had specific agencies administering the SDG program, and it was open to really anyone who was a first-time recipient of rental assistance. And so it was a much larger program, open to really anyone in the community, perhaps someone who was new to the Section 8 or RAP programs or was working with the housing authority. And so, some of this is carryover from that. It's not likely that you're going to be working with someone who has applied for the program within the past year and a half. She will also tell you that the person's not eligible if we have paid out any rental assistance twice on a tenant's behalf. So if they have applied and a landlord submitted a claim two times, then that's it. They're not going to be eligible again for the program. What gets a little trickier is sometimes, a person may have applied to the program twice in the past. Perhaps there's been one payout to a landlord, but we need more information about what happened to the second apartment. And so if there's any questions about where the person's been since they used the apartment, since they used the SDG a second time, then she may tell you to get additional information for her. Obviously, if someone has been living in or staying in a homeless shelter, or we know that they've been outside for more than 2 months, that should be enough information to satisfy any question marks. Because with the program, a landlord has 45 days to submit a claim to the Department of Housing. So obviously, if someone has been experiencing homelessness for more than 45 days, that means that window of time to submit a claim So again, thinking about who's eligible, this just spells it out. A person needs to be literally homeless, and they also need to demonstrate that they can afford the rent. And so we'll spend a lot of time today talking about affordability. The Department of Housing uses a ratio of 60% of income to rent. So for example, the rent cannot be any more than 60% of a household income in order to meet the affordability standard. And again, we know that would be a household that's severely rent burdened, but in order to be able to utilize this resource, then people need to have a rent that does exceed have to have an income that exceeds their rent. And then, of course, household income must not exceed 150% of the federal poverty level. In the packet that we're going to share with you, we have federal poverty level standards from 2017. So if for some reason you're working with a household that's pretty close to that income limit line, please reach out to us to talk about an exception, because Obviously, 2017 was 5 years ago. So, and those have increased slightly. So use the 2017s for the majority of the households that you're working with. But again, if the person is slightly over income based on those standards, then please reach out to us to see if we can grant an exception. Any questions up until this point? Okay. And then everyone's favorite is our paperwork and all of the forms. Julia, did the packet go out to people yet in their email?
I didn't see a packet. Was it like with the original invite or?
No, it was the one I sent to you.
Oh, the
earlier
one you
today.
sent me. Oh, not yet. Sorry.
That's
No.
it.
Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. So because of COVID, we did change a few of the forms. And so when you receive them, you're going to receive a packet that says COVID forms, and then there are our standard forms. Because we're still in COVID, we can continue to use the COVID. The only difference between what I'm going to show you today and the forms that you'll receive is that the watermark will either say DOH or COVID on them. Any of the forms that have a watermark need to come back to the department. Typically in non-COVID times, we do ask for originals of these forms. So after you share everything electronically with Julia, if you can send along the originals, that is most helpful. We will check and compare original signatures when a landlord submits a claim, and that's done for fraud reasons. And so that's helpful for us to have. But of course, given everyone's remote work, we did change things around during COVID to allow for electronic submission. So the first one is our SDG 4. You will notice in the top left corner that all of the forms are numbered. The forms do skip, and that was done intentionally just in case we needed to add some along the way. We could slip more in because that's what everyone needs is more paperwork. But the first one to start with is the application. And so again, on all of these, please make sure every line is complete, even if the answer is 0 or not applicable. You want to make sure that you do fill everything out. So basic information for all of the household members on here. And again, please make sure that everyone listed on the application is also listed on the lease. You really want to make sure that everything is consistent. And so that's some of what Julia and Margaret are looking for when they're reviewing these, to make sure that all of the information is consistent across the packet. So their current address, where they're currently residing, along with whom is going to be living in the household, and is that tenant eligible based on either literal homelessness or because they're a survivor of domestic violence. And then we ask again, kind of that itemization of their current income. And again, if we ask that you fill out everything on here, if someone's receiving employment, and they have to be pay stubs. So if someone is working under the table or doing, some side work for someone, that would not count toward employment. So it would have to be, again, someone who is working on record and receiving pay stubs from their employer. For total household income, although it does not specify it on here, they're just looking for the cash income. And so in the calculation, you would submit their SNAP benefit. The reason they list SNAP is that if someone has 0 income, they want to be able to see that someone can afford food for their household, but it's not included in on here, there's the poverty scale limit. And again, you would just refer to that 150% of federal poverty level chart that you will receive. And for the household size, enter in the maximum amount. And then again, they want you to compare the total income to the maximum. So a lot of the lines on here are really comparing what the standard is to what is applicable to the household. They want to show all of the work, so to speak. And then at the bottom, please list the address of the intended permanent housing unit that person is moving to and the dates that they're going to take occupancy. And please, again, make sure that the dates match to what is on the lease. On page 2, again, you'll want to note if the person's receiving a rental subsidy, the name of the housing authority, and what the tenant portion of rent is going to be. And again, they will ask for a copy of the letter identifying what the tenant portion is going to be. Next portion is most important if someone is not receiving a subsidy, because we have had people that are moving out of, say, shelter on their own. They're going to pay for a unit out of pocket and they just need help with that security deposit. So this is where the rent affordability is probably most important. So again, what is the total rent per month? What's their income? And as long as that 60% is higher than the total rent per month, then the unit is affordable. The next section asks how much security deposit you're requesting, and always a helpful reminder that in Connecticut, if someone is over the age of 62, then they are not required to pay any more than 1 month of security deposit assistance. And then, of course, you'll identify if the, what is the approved amount. The next section is on the HUT database. So again, we talked about calling Penny to do that lookup for you. This is where the information gets recorded and she'll tell you what to write in there. And then you will be the one as the provider to check off if the application was approved or denied. I cannot think of any reason that you would deny the application for someone, again, because it's your client that you're working with hand in hand to get this paperwork in. And then at the bottom, anyone over the age of 18 would sign off on the application. And then you, as the provider working with that individual, would sign off as the staff person along with your contact information. Any questions on that one before I go on? Okay. The next required form in the packet is the inspection. And again, I think what is surprising to a lot of our providers is that the only requirement is that the tenant and the landlord be present at the time of the inspection. And they're the only parties that are responsible for signing off on this particular document. Because of COVID, we were able to make some modifications. So if there's a third party entity that is conducting the inspection, we are able to attach that to this particular form as acceptance of that inspection. Prior to COVID, we had to have this form completed and signed by the tenant and the landlord. Typically, I know all of you are usually, again, going out to see units with the tenant, kind of helping them maybe to fill some of this out. And particularly if there's cosmetic flaws to the unit that, kind of instructing them, hey, let's write down that there's a chip in the countertop, or that there is, I don't know, like a chip in the door or something of that nature. But again, I think most of what we're seeing is that there's a third party inspection, which I feel better about, just in terms of being able to protect acceptable to attach.
Lee, if I could just add for the inspection, like if the client's already going out there, it's helpful to still do the tenant inspection at the same time, because we've had trouble getting a copy of the inspection report back in like a reasonable time when it comes to lease signing and all of that stuff. If it can't happen, of course, we will use the Section 8 or whatever voucher inspection that was done. But if you're already going to the landlord and filling out all of the forms, if you just add that into one of the things, it's usually faster than us having to wait to request the housing authority inspection form.
Agreed, yes. And particularly on here, you know, make sure that there's smoke detectors working in the units. Also that they want to know that when the home was built, because if it was built before 1978, they're looking for possibility of lead paint. And if there's any questions, you can look on the assessor's website to find the year that the property was built. And if you need help with that, please reach out. But usually I use appraisal to do those lookups. And then next is our landlord agreement. And again, this is one of the forms that has to come back to DOH. So this is essentially proof that the landlord and the verification that the landlord has been approved, that when the tenant moves out of the unit, they can file a claim if necessary. And so again, just making sure that this is fully completed, that in particular, the rental unit aligns with the information and the rest of the application, what's on the, as well as what's on the lease, and that all parties living in the apartment are named on the lease. And what is the total amount of the monthly rent on here is also important, because we want to make sure that we're not going above the maximum of 2 months of security deposit assistance for people. And again, the landlord is asked to identify who checks should be made payable to, where those should be mailed. If they're using a property management company, we would ask for a copy of the property management agreement or a letter from the landlord that authorizes the property manager to collect security deposit payments on their behalf. You know, something that in writing connects the landlord to the property management company. And then at the bottom, we would of course ask that the landlord sign at the bottom, and then the signature of the CAN manager is where Margaret or Julia would sign. At the very bottom, this for office use only, you are the office, so we would ask that you fill out that portion as well. And the purpose of that section is that sometimes a tenant does put a portion of their own funding toward the security deposit. So if there's ever an instance where we're splitting security between, say, SDG and the tenant, again, it's spelled out there what the tenant is responsible for. What's also important to know is that this is not transferable. So if a tenant leaves the unit for which they use this assistance, this is not going to go with them. If for some reason there was, you know, a fire, flood, natural disaster, and the landlord transition that tenant from, you know, unit A to unit B, please have the landlord or tenant reach out to DOH, because in the future, if it says on this form, the tenant rented unit A and the landlord's putting in a claim for unit B, because again, maybe there was a flood in the building and tenant had to move, the claim would be denied, because when they put in the claim, again, it's got to match what's in the original paperwork. And so usually that's where people get a little bit tripped up, or the tenant thinks that the security deposit's going to move with them when they move, and it does not. It's really just good for that particular unit. Any questions about that? All right. So then there's some additional forms in the packet as well. And again, all of the forms need to be completed. That's what Julia and Margaret are going to be looking for. We ask that everything get uploaded as one large packet just because it makes reviewing it a little bit easier. But some of the other forms include the tenant requirements as well as landlord information, again, just to give them a little bit more information about the expectations of the project. For the tenant, we ask that they do not move into the unit before this is approved. If we're reviewing paperwork and they have moved into the unit prior to our approval, it could be a reason that they would be denied the assistance. Also, obviously reminding the tenant that they need to pay their tenant portion of rent every month. If there's any problems with the apartment, to let them know, the landlord know right away, to keep the apartment clean. If they are moving, if the tenant's moving, to please notify the Department of Housing. The reason being is that, again, we're trying to prevent any fraudulent claims from the landlord in the event that the tenant moves out, say February of 2022, and then the landlord's putting in a claim in February of 2023, right, when the tenant hasn't been living there for a year. So it's just a way to try to protect the tenant. And of course, if a claim is paid on the tenant's behalf, it could impact their ability to use this program in the future. On the landlord side, again, we very much upfront tell them that it is a guarantee, it is not cash. This is intended to be a legal form of payment, so a landlord cannot deny SDG legally. I know that this may not always be popular because landlords of payment, and so if you're running into any challenges with that landlord, we are happy to reach out to them to have that conversation. And then the next two bullets just talk about some of the forms that the landlord and tenant need to sign off on. And then, of course, not to allow the tenant to move in unless an exception is made. And then we just ask that you fill in your agency name, and the landlord has, technically they have 2 months to get some of this paperwork back to us, but they need to do it before the lease signing, of course, and before the tenant moves in. Again, just for your reference, what is typically required of all of you and the forms that need to be returned to the Department of Housing, as we have talked about before. And again, just a checklist of all of the required identification purposes. If there are children in the household, they do ask for the long form of the birth certificate, and that's just to show that the adults in the household are the parents of the children. Again, if you have some familial relationships, maybe it's grandma who has custody of the children or an aunt, something of that effect, we would just ask for documentation of that as well. And that's the proof of income information that we had talked about previously. If for some reason you are having a hard time getting any of the photo IDs for any of the household members, this is just additional documentation that can be used. It's through the Department of Motor Vehicles website. So all intended to be legal forms of identification. And again, we've had situations where someone may have a social security card, they have a photo ID, but they can't get their birth certificate because they were born out of the country or whatever it may be. If there's one piece of documentation that you're struggling to get, just reach out because we may be able to make that exception, particularly if you have two of the three pieces of vital docs available. And again, usually people or the providers are going out with the tenant, oftentimes initiating the discussion about security deposit, about the leasing process for the client. Again, kind of my recommendation would be to put some of the forms together as a packet for your client, so that if they are going to meet with a landlord on their own or independently, they would have what we call the certificate of eligibility. That's again in the packet, the SDG 8, that shows and outlines that yes, this person has been determined to be eligible for SDG. This is what the program entails. This is some of the paperwork that will need to be filled out by the landlord and the tenant. And so really it would be like that certificate of eligibility, the tenant requirements, the landlord expectations, along with the inspection form. And then again, this is just notes for you to refer back to at a later point in time, that when all of the paperwork is received, to upload that to the smart sheet that Julia had put in the chat. And Julia, is there another place that people can access that link or refer to locally?
I can put it on, like when I send out the files later, I can just put it in that email. And I don't really mind if people just email me the files directly either. It's no big deal if you feel like you're losing links all the time. You just want to email me, as long as you just put in like the subject line or something so it's easily searchable.
And also make sure to do it through a secure link as well, right? Or so that it's encrypted. And probably the best way to do it might be just to upload to HMIS as well.
And if you do upload to HMIS, still send me an email. Just let me know, because we don't get notified if something goes in HMIS. So I don't want to miss your client's move-in date.
Okay. And then again, what's really nice is that Julia and Margaret will do a lot of that administrative back end work for all of you. If there is a point in time only using snail mail, then of course this is the local point or the address for the Department of Housing where those packets get mailed to. But right now, again, Julia is taking care of all that stuff electronically to submit.
How do we advocate that never happens?
You don't have to worry about that, Margaret.
Thanks.
All right, so any questions? Usually the questions come the first time that you do it. Have most of you submitted packets, or is this brand new to those on the call? I know, Sylvia, it's brand new to you.
I'm going to have my first packet coming up soon, but yeah, I think you're right. When I actually do it, there'll be questions.
This has been in my life for 10 years, but I never really saw the process and I never believed it because it sounded too difficult, and it is. Believe one time I had a fight with Lydia about why I couldn't use something else. And then she finally said, that's what COH wants.
Or can. What's that,
I'm going
Sylvia?
to call Lee. I don't believe you.
Ah. And we do. I mean, we, you know, I think we try to be flexible where we can. I think we've tried to be flexible over time with this project, knowing that there's a fair amount of paperwork and requirements for this project. Okay.
So I do have one question. I utilize DocuSign a lot. So I'm, based on earlier comments, I'm going to assume that you prefer real signatures versus electronic ones, or are DocuSign okay as long as it comes with like a certificate that it was done by them?
Yeah, I think, Katrina, since we are still oftentimes working remotely, DocuSign would be fine. If your agency's able to do it, I think that's great. Okay, so as a follow-up to this, you'll get the slides to refer back to for reference. We'll work to get this recording out to all of you as well. That will take me a couple of days to get posted. And then if there are any questions along the way, Julia and Margaret are certainly well versed in this, and or certainly reach out to myself.
I think the last thing I want to just like really put an exclamation point on is make sure all the dates match. We need to make sure that the occupancy date matches the start date of the rental calculation. So all of those dates have to match. If not, like we need to either alter the lease, ask JDA or a housing authority to change the rental calculation start date. But Penny is like really strict. All of those dates must match each other. And that's the biggest error we usually see in the applications. So wanting to point that out for everyone.
And give yourself time to do this, right? And so sometimes if the landlord is, you know, saying you can move in sooner, you know, it might be negotiating a few more days just to make sure that everything is done correctly. And that's really your work to advocate on your client's behalf. I know that they're often very anxious to get into their own place, leave shelter, etc. But it's also like you need to have this done right, because the worst case scenario is this gets denied for some reason after someone moves into the unit, and then you're scrambling to try to backtrack and find another funding source to provide security deposit for them. So we don't want that to happen. So a little bit more due diligence up front obviously causes less headaches down the line. All right, so thank you all. Julia or Margaret, if you can just get me the attendance form or list, that would be really helpful. You know, what we have done is that each of your agencies really tried to identify one primary point, interact with Penny, or that would really kind of review some of this before you submit to Julia and Margaret. So certainly lean on your colleagues at each of your agencies who have done this a little bit more frequently, but I know that sometimes you need to rely on others, particularly if you're trying to move someone in quickly, so they can be a support to you as well. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day, and you'll be getting a bunch of stuff from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you.